Hey guys, it's Joel. Welcome to the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast. And one of the things that a lot of people have requested in the break that I talk about is borderline personality disorder. And I'm not like a BPD expert, so I kind of resisted that topic. I treat a lot of borderlines. I like treating borderlines. I don't really love it as a diagnosis. I think it's kind of useless. So I'll say that I treat a lot of people that have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but the way that it is used, I don't really think works very well. So I'm not, anyway, soft critic of a lot of things. And one of the things about BPD or borderline personality disorder is it's part of something that used to be, I guess, what you would call the Axis 2 and the DSM-4. And they got rid of the axes and they replaced them with nothing, I guess. But what was nice about those is that they kind of grouped histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder, and a couple of others together in this way that was useful because they share features a lot of the time. And one of the things that was helpful to me when I was in school and I was learning about a personality disorder is you go to social work school and you read the book that they assign, and then you go in and you talk about it and you listen to the lecture and you take a test on what you read or whatever. And they told us before we took the test for the personality disorders, especially the cluster B, they told us when you read these, you're going to say, oh my God, I have all of them. Because we all do all of these things some of the time. You know, a narcissist may do that, but we all do it because we all get pulled into these deflection and defense mechanisms. And so maybe someone is smarter than me or they're more wealthy than me. And so I talk about a thing that I own that's nice that I know they don't have, or I talk about a thing that I know about, but they don't know about. I'm not a narcissist because I'm not doing that all the time, but I still did it. It's still bad. I may be just so desperate to not deal with something, to not know how to handle a part of my emotional experience that I aggravate my wife and I pull her into my anger so that we're angry together and I'm not alone. That doesn't mean that I'm borderline. I might just need attention really badly because I don't know how to express how alone I am. And I do this thing that means that people pay attention to me. That's kind of crazy or inappropriate. That doesn't mean that I have histrionic personality disorder. So on and so on. But the thing about it is that the conception that I have now of like what I would call a personality disorder. I try not to be pathologizing as a clinician, but what I would conceptualize as a dysregulated personality is when someone has no room for a sense of self or an identity under the defense mechanism, because the whole personality has been replaced with a personality game about inferiority, about attention seeking, about attachment, about loneliness. And there's no room for an authentic self. And that means that I have to switch identities all the time. It means that I don't really know who I am. A long time ago, I was doing therapy with somebody, and they were doing brain spotting. And they were someone who had gotten that personality disorder diagnosis from a lot of other people. And I told them, I don't really think that way. You meet criteria for some other things. I try and give you the least pathologizing diagnosis that's accurate. And I don't know that you meet criteria for that now. I think if we deal with trauma, that will come down. But they definitely had that thing where they were trying to figure out what other people wanted so that they could be that all the time. And I could have pointed that out. And they would have said, oh, no, that's not true because I disagree with people or whatever. It's a deeply held implicit emotional belief in the brainstem, in the subcortical brain, about how we make predictions about what we need to survive, not a conscious understanding, not a conscious awareness. And so pointing out that was happening, it never would have worked. But one of the things during brain spotting, this person had a experience where they said, I realized that I was angry with you because I wanted you to tell me what to do, and you were just telling me to look at the pointer. And you wouldn't tell me what you wanted me to do. And I was so panicked because I needed to be what you needed, and you didn't need anything. And then I felt a snap, and I became separate from you, and I realized I'm my own person. I can do what I want. And then I felt another snap, and then I became separate from everyone in the world, and I became my own person. And I realized I'm able to just do what I want. And I said, oh, that's great. I appreciate that insight. That's really beautiful. But they felt something, like Eugene Glendon would say in the felt sense, or a neuroscientist would say in the interoceptive. That was a truth that I couldn't have explained to them, that they would have resisted because they couldn't see it. The game prevented that. And that's why especially cluster B personality disorders are so stigmatized and so easily judged, is because everybody likes to get on Knowledge Fight and listen to Alex Jones and be like, can you believe it? Like, they just show the evidence to him and he says, oh, that's not real. And then they say, well, yeah, it is real. And then he says, oh, well, it was made up by somebody else, even though it is real. And they say, well, here's proof that it wasn't made up. And then he says, oh, well, and on and on and on. Like, it's all deflection. And people just get so angry that this person can't see it. But that's kind of what therapists feel all the time, because when you come into the room, most intuitive therapists kind of know what's going on, but they can't quite tell you yet because you're not ready to hear it on a felt emotional level. And it's the job of the therapy modality or the therapist to lead you into the place where you can tell yourself, because you're the only one that can. And that's how you treat somebody with an attachment disorder that, the DSM-4 or 5 would call a personality disorder, is when there's somebody who's playing a game all the time that they don't even know it's a secret, even from themselves, where they're in competition or in anger and aggression, or in desperate need of other people's emotional participation in their inner world because they feel completely incapable of regulating that inner world themselves. That is something that happens. What you want to call it, if you want to say it's BPD or whatever, that is how those cluster B personalities disorders work in my head when I'm doing therapy. And those things are a system. In the last podcast episode, I talked about how we need to understand that these aren't a checklist. Because the problem with BPD is that most people that are diagnosed with it don't actually have it. They're not even close to criteria. It's also used in a very sexist way. I think in the DSM-2, it was passive-aggressive personality disorder, and it was almost entirely women, because a lot of times, especially when the DSM-2's out, I mean, not that we've made a ton of progress on, feminism, but like the people who don't have, external power, hierarchical power, systems power, will develop a system of passive power, and that at that time was going to be mostly women. And then it got merged into the DSM, 3, I think. They got rid of passive aggressive and they made it borderline. But one of the ways that system works is that it needs to kind of be felt out. Why is this person doing the behavior? Because like I said, we all do some of those behaviors some of the time, sometimes for good reason, and sometimes with understandable circumstances that led up to them. And if you go to the ER and you are a woman and you have good reason to be in crisis because you're being abused, because you're being attacked, because bad things have happened, because you're at the worst point in your life, whatever led you to go to the ER with a psych diagnosis, you'll be clocked with a BPD diagnosis a ton of the time. I see that so much on these ER discharges. And that doctor, you may be more emotionally intelligent than the person who diagnosed you with that, the resident who's working the psych ER, because they didn't have time to figure out what's going on. They just knew that you were suicidal or you were in crisis. It's an easy diagnosis. They put it on the sheet. It's not accurate. You maybe had good reason to do that. I see people that are nowhere close to criteria for BPD that have been diagnosed with it multiple times because they encountered medical situation in crisis. And I just want to say here too, like if you have a diagnosis, there's not like one system that shows that to everybody. It's in the hospital. It's like a lot of people are afraid this like goes into some national registry and they track it or whatever. Like there's no way for me to know unless you give me permission to ask for your medical records because you want me to. And then another doctor finally fulfills the request and sends them over. It's not like A lot of people are afraid of the diagnosis because they're afraid that once they get it, it can't change or something. You can go to 10 psychiatrists and you can get 10 diagnoses. You just can. If these systems worked consistently, then I think maybe people would be more willing to consider them a hard science. But they don't. There's all these catch-22s in healthcare that are kind of absurd. I mean, one of the things that drove me nuts, I can say this now because I hope I don't ever have to work at the hospital again, I hope. But like when I was at the hospital, they were always like, I mean, some people would have 30 diagnoses in the system and would be like, they'd be like, you have to delete all these. Well, why? Because they're wrong. They're not right. Well, a doctor diagnosed them with it. Why are they wrong? Oh, they just come and they pick up these diagnoses in the ER or in the psych, but we know the person and they don't have that. So just delete all these from the treatment plan. Okay, well, I'll delete them from the treatment plan, but they're imported like every single time. So can we just delete them from the system so that it doesn't do that? Because you're always mad when somebody forgets to delete them. No, you're a social worker. You can't delete a doctor's diagnosis, but it's 13 years old and you just told me it's wrong. No, but you're a social worker. You can't delete a doctor's diagnosis. Okay, fine. Can a doctor change the diagnosis? Oh, yeah, a doctor could. Okay, can we get a doctor to do that? No, doctors don't change other doctors' diagnoses. I mean, I heard that so many times. And what? It's wrong. Get it out of the computer. These catch-22s riddle healthcare, and they're absurd. I talked about the Star D scandal last time. I'm not going to go over that one again, but like look up, the body of science that says the system should work this way and how that body of science actually works so that you can have an informed critique and also protect yourself while getting what you need out of it, because we still have to participate in psychological healthcare. We need to know these things. A lot of borderline, it's an interesting diagnosis because it happened at this time where they were trying to put things into categories. And the people who came up with them, they were like, well, there's these people that are psychotic, like they see ghosts and spirits and hear voices, and they, think that they're talking to aliens or whatever, and that's not real. And then there's these people that are neurotic, and they just have fixations, anxiety, fits, anger, different things. But they still are oriented in reality in a way the psychotic people aren't. But these things that they were trying to define that would later be called, a borderline group in 1938. I think Stern was the guy that did that one. I think it was Adolf Stern. Don't quote me. He was like, these patients are in this borderline group because they're relatively oriented to reality. Like they're in the same reality as us, more so than the reality that the person with schizophrenia is in, but they sometimes aren't. So what do we do with them if they're not psychotic and they're not neurotic? Because I'm doing therapy with this person, and while I'm doing therapy with them, they're telling me about all this stuff and it's real. And then all of a sudden we get into emotional territory, and then I'm attacking them. They won't answer the question because I lunged across the room and I said, well, I leaned forward slightly, but I don't, no, you did this and you're just my dad, and I will now have a boundary against you, or, whatever. And then you're like, well, and then other times, well, 4 other people were there and we're doing family therapy, and they all said that this person just said this kind of slight criticism of you, and you're saying that they yelled at you and attacked you, and well, they're all in a conspiracy against me. But they don't have a psychotic paranoia, like paranoid schizophrenia, but they only around these things they lose all touch with reality. Reality becomes plastic when you have an emotional need, an emotional narrative that is so deep and so true to you that when it is challenged, all of a sudden your mind confabulates ways that the narrative that is more important than any other system in the brain has to be real. And that's what a personality disorder is doing, but it's only around certain things. It's not all the time. You can still have a good day. You can still go into a Walmart and get a coffee, and why coffee at Walmart, but whatever. You can go to a restaurant and do different things, and your beliefs are not being challenged. These issues are not coming up, and then all of a sudden, maybe somebody comes to me and they say something, and then it comes up. But it wasn't traditional psychosis because it wasn't endogenous to the brain. It was part of a story they were telling. And then you have like Otto Kernberg, who comes in and plays with the idea, and he says, they can reality test most of the time, but only have primitive, this is their language, not mine, defenses like splitting and exaggerated affect, And when the modern diagnostic system came about in 1980, when the DSM-3 came out, borderline personality disorder became this formal diagnosis that it focused less on psychosis and more on emotional instability and identity disturbance and fear of abandonment and impulsivity. And the border concept was never renamed. It's still there. And in contemporary trauma-informed models, most people would say it's an attachment disorder, that it comes from like really early childhood wounds, one or many, where somebody is playing this game of trying to be safe all the time, but they don't know that the world actually is safe now. And unlike someone with PTSD that's having flashbacks or physical emotional re-experiencing, you can have both. You can have BPD and PTSD. Most people do, and those disorders, one of the reasons I don't like them is that there probably should be 3 or 4, overlapping, whatever. But that idea that this person is on the border of sanity, but certain things knock them off the edge of tolerable emotional experience, out of the window of tolerance, and then things become not real for them. And one of the things these early guys noticed is like these patients don't respond to psychoanalysis. You can give them so much insight. You can give them so much relationship. You can give them so much love. And all that happens is that they need more and more and more, which is why a lot of people say that BPD, you sense it in the room as somebody having a black hole. Also, I noticed that a lot of borderline patients around the chest, they have a feeling of a black hole sucking or a burning heat. There is kind of a void that shows up in somatic work with that. And a lot of that, those early clinicians were sort of trying to figure out what it was. And that's the history of it that we forget, because let's remember how many times the DSM changed its entire idea. Because the DSM kind of changed. I have an article about like how America changes psychology and psychiatry to fit its own identity of what itself, what how we define self, what selfhood is, like in any era. And the DSM rebranded essentially 3 times. It's interesting to me that in the first DSM, they said this will never be used for insurance billing, for classification, only for research and medical treatment. And that lasted about 2 weeks. But the DSM, it rebranded 3 times basically. So there was, at first it's looking at reactions. It's looking at these systematic, dynamic systems that are out of balance. And then you get, the empty, dull thud experiments that Rosenhan did. A lot of the DSM-3 was a response to that, where, he said, we never solved this problem, by the way, too. Somebody should do the Rosenhan experiment again. You'd probably go to jail and lose your license at this point. You wouldn't be able to teach at Harvard. But what Rosenhan did was he told all of his graduate psych students, we're going to go get committed. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to go in and we're going to say, we heard a voice say empty, dull thud. We hear a voice that says empty, dull thud. And everyone says the psychiatrist is this genius who's able to, just detect what's going on in the person. And we're going to prove that that's not right. And they went in and they did it. And all these Harvard graduate clinical psych students get committed. And then they can't get out. And then eventually they get out and they publish a paper and they say, this is bullshit. You don't know what people have. We just went in and said this. And then you also have people like R.D. Lang, who are incredibly critical and of organized psychiatry, and they lead the anti-psychiatry movement in the 60s and the 70s. And so the DSM says, okay, fine. We're going to take away all of that subjective intuition to detect systems and things out of balance and whatever. And the psychiatrist is no longer allowed to trust their autonomy. They're no longer to trust subjective intuition. And a lot of psychiatry at this time was abusive. There should be checks on that. But, the history of this profession, it's corrections and way over corrections in the wrong direction, because we can't identify like what needs to change. We just change everything. We could, but we don't. And so after that, they said they'll just be checklists. There'll be checklists for everything. And if you check these boxes, you have this diagnosis. Now it's scientific. Now it's based on numbers. Now it's based on order. And because it's based on that, so you get this checklist model that keeps the borderline name, even though it's no longer about systems. So it doesn't quite make sense, because what is it on a border between the neurosis and psychosis thing? It's not how they want to conceive of it anymore. And now, the DSM-4, they acted like they were going to get further with the Human Genome Project and all these different research studies, and they were going to understand the brain-mind problem, where consciousness really was, what it was doing. We'll find more biological variables that are because they keep trying to turn psychiatry into the germ theory. Like, we have to find the thing that causes these. We can't look at the environment at all. Like, it's not any of those things. We don't want to talk about what your mom did. We don't want to talk about, trauma. We don't want to talk about racism. We don't want to talk about systemic problems, access to healthcare. We just want to find the biological variable that's the reason why you are defective. But suffering is a part of making meaning. It's part of us. We can't, that project didn't really work. And so the DSM-4 is kind of rushed out and highly criticized and not well. And it starts with the DSM-4 TR and then furthered by the 5 to move to this spectrum model, where they're like, okay, well, it's a diagnosis, but then the diagnoses are like all wrong and don't work. So we're going to put it on a spectrum where you have a little bit or a lot of it, which also doesn't really work. They did that with autism too. And they wanted to, not change that underlying assumption that suffering is a biological defect. They didn't want to change that to that it could be this meaningful response to life that can be engaged with, because that's too messy. And so it makes this persistence of BPD this kind of deeply strange diagnosis that's like a fossil from the first era that is prevalent enough that it sticks around, but that all the assumptions about it and how to treat it and even its name don't make any sense in the 3 eras in which it has lived. And so it now sits kind of awkwardly in the spectrum model, but we can't really link it to trauma because PTSD is different, but like you had to have the trauma to get that hasn't, read the DSM-5 entries on these things. They don't explain that relationship well because they still need it to be a diagnosis that's a code for insurance and not a system of trauma when, 40 years ago, and now you have a personality disorder, what is the... So the result is this diagnosis that pathologizes a person's survival mechanism that was useful at one time or they wouldn't have it. We tend to not do things for no reason as humans. It doesn't make sense in the time that they're doing it now in the present, but it's this permanent internal disease, defense that the person forgot why it existed. But it's not a disease that comes from a germ. So you're still trying to blame the patient's biology, for their adaptation to this chaotic environment. Which is one of the reasons why I don't really like the diagnosis, is it doesn't really spell that out. That all has to be inferred clinically. You get it at a training. But it's not part of the actual conceptualization that's supposed to be undergirding the profession. And so, that term comes from 20th century psychology. And those clinicians were noticing these patients that didn't fit into the categories at the time. And they tried to make them fit into the categories for the next cycle and the next one. And it hasn't really fit, because on one side of the border was neurotic disorders and the other side of the border was psychosis. And the borderline people were saying basically they're sort of in the middle of psychosis some of the time because reality can become plastic to them. But remember what I said about social work school though, right? Like, we all do some of these things some of the time. And we do them when we're at more stress. So if I'm in an environment where I lose my job, I have no money, and then I'm out of my window of tolerance all the time, and I start acting worse, do I have BPD all of a sudden? I said I do that stuff to my wife some of the time. My life gets worse. Maybe I do it more. If I'm rich enough that I can insulate myself from all the consequences of doing it, then do I not have it? Does the person who is poorer have more BPD because they're in an environment that is activating the symptom more of the time? I don't know. You guys tell me, because it's not in the DSM. That is still roughly a checklist, even if they tried to make it, a spectrum differential diagnosis. It doesn't really explain how to handle those things well at the conceptualization phase. And the DSM is supposed to be how we conceptualize things. So I don't know. You tell me how to do with it. I've asked this question at a lot of conferences, and people are like, yeah, well, the DSM says that, and then you just go do your own thing. Okay, why is it there? You don't have to take my word for it. I'm not the first person to make this argument, or the best person. Thomas Zaz makes the myth, in the 60s argument and says, like, disease is a physical thing in the body. So saying mental illness is stupid because mental illness is just a metaphor for problems in living. And we should just view them as that, not, they don't need to be diseases at all. You have, Thomas Ensel is the biology argument where he's like, the DSM is at best, it's just a dictionary. It's a weakness because it has no validity. Other medicine has a blood test that tells you if you have a disease. This one is just this stuff that changes all the time. Even patients that we're screening regularly are getting different disorders. So I don't really think it works. We're going to move our funding away from it. Alan Francis said, he argued, I think Saving Normal was his book, but he said, the DSM-5 process was sloppy and it led to this diagnostic inflation because you're putting people on a spectrum. And now all of a sudden you're putting more people on it because you've broadened by the definition of spectrum. It's not one destination. It's now this range. You've broadened it. And now everybody is meeting these categories, which I think that's kind of true. I mean, I have a lot of people that write me and try and get me to say that I have autism or that I have ADHD. And I definitely have, some traits that are ADHD and autistic-like. But and I'm not saying one way or the other. I just kind of don't care because those things are things that I use in my life to be successful, and they're not detracting from anything. I'm not having problems getting things done that I want to do. And so I don't really need treatment for it, but they're like, but you still have to identify with that and live it to be a mental illness informed clinician, or not informed. What do they call it? I don't know. You're representing the community or something. And my thing is that, if you want to say that I have autism, I'm not saying I don't, then you're saying that everybody who's a little bit intuitive, everybody who can kind of understand the way these systems work in a way that they're unimpressed with hierarchies, and they're able to read behavior, and they're able to be, deeply recognize patterns and synthesize information, and they maybe have a wandering focus of interest that's very specific. I'm not saying that is or isn't autism, that I am or am not autistic, but what I'm saying is that if you want to make that the diagnosis, how many people is that in the country, right? These spectrums, have these huge ranges, which is what Francis is pointing out. You have Kerry Greenberg, and he says that the DSM is basically a work of fiction. It's this noble lie that insurance is making clinicians tell, even though a lot of them, when they pull them anonymously, they don't want to. And these are just voted into existence by a group of psychiatrists that say, hey, this exists this year. I blocked, I think, by this person in Australia or somewhere, psychiatrist, and she was talking about how it was so important to have a diagnosis, and if you didn't have one, you couldn't get better, whatever. And I was just like, okay, thought experiment. Why? And she was like, because that's what lets you love yourself and accept all the parts of yourself and understand how you think and then heal. I was like, okay, no, I think loving yourself, accepting yourself and understanding the parts of yourself, and then healing and raising your window of tolerance are the thing that matters, not the code. If I did that for reactive attachment disorder as an adult in the DSM-2 and learned how to do all those things, and then all of a sudden the DSM-3 said, never mind, anyone over 14 can't have reactive attachment disorder. Does that mean, which that was a useful diagnosis, I wish they kept that one around. Then why, does that mean that I don't have those three things all of a sudden? That I have to be oh, I got to go treat another diagnosis. I don't love myself anymore. I don't understand how I think, and I definitely can't accept anything or act effectively. No. That was the point. The diagnosis was arbitrary. She blocked me. She didn't respond, so I don't know. And I said it nice. I said it like that. But the French philosopher who, Foucault, he said, mental illness is not really a scientific fact, but it's this cultural tool, and then it's used to silence and control people who don't fit the rational, productive norms. I largely think that I don't lean into those kind of arguments. They get made a lot on kind of fringy podcasts and things, because I don't think it's that intentional. I don't think that the psychiatrists think that they're doing this evil thing and that hoodwinking everybody. I think there's a system that is an incentive structure. A lot of it has to do with the profit motive. And that what that system does is it plays on everybody's blind spots and everyone's insecurity, siloing information and making sure everybody only knows a little bit in academia about one thing. I mean, you can't have 12 PhDs, and then you can't talk about anything that you don't know, and you can't see the whole picture. And then you also have to this financial investment. And then you also have to jump through these hoops to win. And then that filters out a lot of the accountability and the insight for people to see this thing intentionally. I mean, there's so many people who work very, very high up in healthcare, in mental health care policy making that I've talked to who don't understand how these things work. And they're interested for a minute and then they get angry and are like, well, that can't be true. And I'm like, it's in a book, not an opinion book, like a book, like that just has things that happened in it. Like you can read the history of the profession. Like you don't have to just start at the point in history in which you were born, because we can write things down. Yeah, you have, David Rosenhan, who we already talked about, and he, said, being sane in insane places is his book. And he said that, like, writing in a journal or, writing things about yourself, those were normal, and he did those all the time. And he was the Harvard professor there. I don't know if he was Harvard, but I think he was in California. Anyway, he was big school at the time. And he was like, that all got pathologized by doctors, and they said that I was crazy, and they were analyzing these normal things that I do just because I was in a psych ward, not in my house. You have, Joanna Moncrief, who says, like, that the chemical imbalance theory about low serotonin and all that, that's just this myth. There's no evidence. That's actually really she had a lot of foresight, because the stuff that's coming out now, they paid for all of this research about 10 years ago that started coming out about, 6 years ago. And most of it was kind of confirming that all of the, we had a guess, we thought, about why antidepressants worked and what they were doing in the brain, because we don't really understand. And then we tested all of those theories neurobiologically, and actually most of them are probably wrong. So we spent a whole lot of money to find out that we know less about why they work. James Davies, he talked about the DSM committees. When they voted on definitions, they often admitted that they had no scientific proof at all. They just sort of thought that was a good way to move the information around. They were doing it more like quantum physicists work, where they just look for holes in the math and then kind of plug the hole. To draw the line between normal and disorder was really hard. And that even in these rooms where these people are supposed to be doing the most scientific thing, they're just kind of like, this is what I think. And what's scary is a lot of them have no patient contact for many, many years. I mean, a lot of psychiatrists have never been in therapy, and a lot of psychiatrists have never done therapy. I would say most of them. If they've done any, it's like CBT or DBT group, or, I volunteered at the Student Counseling Center, there's a gap between working at the Student Counseling Center and what I do. There's also an enormous gap between doing any kind of therapy at all and doing your psych rotation in the ER, which, I mean, psychiatrists spend more time in psych than that, but normal doctors, like, their encounter with psychology and psychiatry during their, training is that they're in the psych ER or the ER, just doing psych admission. But, the R.D. Lang is an interesting one. I won't go on anymore about history people, and I've talked about him before, but, he talked about just making a profound connection with people, and psychosis was so healing, and it was our humanity and our story. And even if it was psychotic, if you participate in somebody's story, it starts to ground them and relationally invigorate them. And I think that's true, because I've had a lot of dissociative identity disorder patients. It's really overdiagnosed some places. So if you ever meet somebody that's like, I see 30 DID people, unless they're in some kind of like specialized treatment facility, they're overdiagnosing. I mean, you maybe get one a year or something, but I've seen a lot in my career. And one of the things that with DID is that a lot of times they feel so unsafe, they are so activated that they don't remember 40 minutes of a 50-minute session with me. And then they start to remember more, because it's not an intellectual, logical thing. It's that their body is starting to be more safe. They're starting to trust me, and they're starting to calm down. And it doesn't matter if there's an intellectual memory of it, because the safety is the point, and the session is still productive, without me delivering a whole lot of information that they remember. Because therapy is not really just like raising children or a lot of our communication. It's not what we tell our kids to do. It's not what we say. A lot of it is what we do and embody and are, is what makes the connection. I mean, those are the old people. There's a ton of newer people like Alan Horwitz and Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate, I think is kind of reductive in some areas, but there's, if you don't want to, if you say like your only evidence for why depth psychology is good is, people from the 60s, which people say a lot, Ann Harrington, she, 2020, Richard Bentall, Robert Whitaker, Owen Hooley, like these are big modern figures who know a lot more than me and make the argument probably a lot better than I can do, in this hour. But I think that there's this kind of like two-pronged problem where there's this belief that BPD patients have this unfair explanation on the clinician and they don't benefit from therapy because they can't have insight, which I don't think is true. I think a lot of times when you just treat trauma and you build a lot of somatic and relational safety, a lot of those symptoms come down. That's been my experience with most people. I mean, there's some people where you have to have very firm boundaries because they're going to try and contact you out of session or cross lines. And that would be what I think, the people that, basically can't function well enough in the therapeutic relationship to get better in therapy. That may not be a bad line to draw if you want to keep BPD around as a diagnosis and say, this is BPD and this isn't. It may be the line where individual therapy just doesn't work because the person is not able to obey the rules of a relationship enough to benefit in individual therapy. And they need, group therapy, a DBT group, or something that is a little bit more structured where they're not allowed to have to make these decisions that they can't make yet about relationships and interaction and, appropriately. If they're going to violate the rules of what is acceptable behavior in a therapeutic relationship enough that therapy just won't work. If you're going to keep that disorder around, let's draw the line there. Not like a woman went to the ER one time. Like I don't think that's tenable or scientific. So, I mean, if you want to look at BPD as a diagnosis, the thing that I was saying about autism, like if you want to make the spectrum big enough to include me, how many people are we including there? How many people become autistic? And I'm not saying that that's wrong or not the direction to go. I'm just saying that if you look at the way that they're going with the DSM-5, it's going to say that a lot more people have a spectrum disorder, albeit still a disorder, if you continue to innovate on it in the direction they're taking it. Look at the symptoms, though, of BPD. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. We'll look at American foreign policy and obsession with exceptionalism and that we somehow are this exception to all the rules, or this deep-seated geopolitical anxiety that we have all the time, that we have to make sure that everyone in the entire world is doing exactly what we want. Is that BPD? Not everybody in America believes that, but enough people participate in those things. Criteria 2, this pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. You can't have any relationship with someone as an equal. You're either above them and they're wonderful, or you're below them and they're terrible. Splitting. I mean, the political polarization, I don't even know if I need to say anything about that one. Idealizing people as messianic saviors and then saying, oh, actually they're terrible, and using some acronym to write them off. How many people in politics, not like politicians, I mean them too, but have been actually consistent if you look at what they say they want and believe? 3, identity disturbance, this marked and persistent pattern of unstable self-image or sense of self. Does America and most Americans have a stable self-image? Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. Our systems, our spending, our national substance abuse, our diet and health, the things that we agree are self-evident in the point of a country. Are we doing anything that is impulsive or potentially self-damaging? Can you think of any? recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. I mean, I don't know, ecology? Ignoring clear warnings about things that are destructive to our citizens if we do them. Number 6 BPD criteria: effective instability due to a marked effective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. Something 24-hour news cycle. Chronic feelings of emptiness, number 7. Look at Instagram or TikTok, especially like some of the mental health or alternative mental health advice. Number 8, inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling your anger. 9, transient stress related to paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Does anybody seem paranoid? Does anyone seem like they are so worried about a big problem that is real, or that their own suffering, and they are hurting, and so because they're hurting, they're maybe misattributing who's hurting them. They think it's an imaginary thing, instead of a very obvious system. We doing that anywhere? There's a documentary, Joel Bacon made it a long time ago, called The Corporation. I think Bacon wrote the book and Mark Akbar directed the movie, and the movie is, follows the book. But the premise of it is this analysis about how under the 14th Amendment, corporations have been granted the legal right of being a person. And so Bacon in his book says, if a corporation's a person, what kind of person is it? And to answer that, let's compare corporate behavior to the World Health Organizations, or the ICD-10, or the DSM, their criteria for antisocial personality disorder, being a sociopath or a psychopath. And the diagnosis that Bacon and the filmmakers argue is that the corporation is not just bad by accident, but it's institutionally mandated to be a psychopath by the laws that govern it. By a law, a corporation's primary duty is to its shareholders, and it must prioritize profit above all else. And if a CEO acts out of genuine altruism at the expense of profit, they can be sued. And so there's a scene in the movie where a bunch of protesters are like, you're making kids, I think it's like the Nike CEO maybe, and they're like, you're making kids knit sneakers in Cambodia for 10 cents an hour, and their fingers are getting cut off, and like, you're terrible. And the CEO and his wife invite everyone in, and they like have coffee with them. And the CEO's like, I agree with you. It's wrong. And if I don't do it, they'll fire me, and they'll get somebody who will. So y'all should make it illegal, because all of the shoe companies do this. I don't know if it's really the CEO of Nike. I saw that movie when I was in 11th grade, I think. I don't know, 20 years. So anyway. And so like, he engages with him and is like, basically, I agree with you, but I'm powerless because I'm an agent of the system. And even if you kill me or I go away, somebody else just comes in and takes my place. So to really do this, you have to say it's self-evident that we should not let corporations make kids get their fingers cut off making shoes for 10 cents. Maybe shoes could just cost a little bit more, or the corporations could take a little bit less profit off, the $300-$400 Jordan that cost $1 to make. And there's this callous unconcern for the feeling of others that he documents that, corporations basically have to act in because they're not concerned with anything but money. If you're going to call them a person legally, then let's look at the mental health of what you just called a person. An incapacity to maintain enduring relationships, a reckless disregard for the safety of others, a deceitful, repeated lying or conning of profit, and an inability to either notice or respond to the truth, an incapacity to experiences of guilt, failure to conform to social norms with respect to law or behavior. I mean, how many corporations just build into their bottom line that they're going to break the law and that they're going to kill people, or they're going to do something terrible with poison that affects, people forever and ever? I mean, what is it? We lit when the train fell off the tracks in Palestine, Ohio, domestically, I'm not talking about Palestine, I'm talking about the Palestine, Ohio, where the train came off the tracks, and there's giant tankers full of polyvinyl chloride. They didn't try and clean it up. They said it was probably too dangerous, so they blew it up and just let black smoke of this chemical that is awful, that we don't even begin to understand what it's doing, not just to people, but to the entire environment for hundreds of years, and pour into the groundwater. And that was the solution. And the argument is not that the people are psychopaths. I'm talking about the CEO who's at the very top because the people aren't. It's that the structure makes these things happen. The structure itself, the legal mandate to pursue profit at all costs creates a pathological pursuit of profit. And that forces an entity to act without a conscience. So when you're looking at BPD, when I'm saying we all do some of these things, some of the time. But when we're unconsciously doing these defense mechanisms all of the time, and it's all that we're doing, and it's all that we are, and that we have another part of ourselves, sure, that's good or that knows it's wrong or that wants a greater good, but just wasn't able to, see the truth or act on, what was a healthy or effective behavior in that moment, which is, what you do in DBT therapy to treat BPD a lot of the time. We have it, but it was secondary, and we weren't embodying it. We were living within a defense mechanism. And we're talking about mental illness being on this spectrum instead of being in this checkbox. How many people are on that spectrum in America? And where is America on that spectrum? Hey guys, I'm hoping that you enjoyed that episode, and I wanted to remind you, if you're in the market, to check out gethardy.com and to use offer code TAPROOT if you would like to try some vitamins. I didn't hear about Hardy from clinicians. I didn't hear about it from advertising. I heard about it from multiple patients, usually with dopamine disorders, that said, hey, I'm treatment resistant. I've tried everything. I've gone all these places, and this is what worked. And so I looked them up because I was skeptical of supplements, and they had paid for a lot of really strong randomized controlled trials proving that their product worked for autism and ADHD in children. It works for a lot of other things too. I'm a clinician, so my focus is on mental health, but Hardy sent me a box after we did a podcast with them, and I started to take them because I take vitamins. I wasn't trying to treat anything, and I felt a lot better. I was like, I really like these. I'm into it. I'm going to see if I can get these, repped through our company or something. And my wife was making fun of me because she thought I was going to be like a radio vitamin guy. And then she started taking them, and I'm pretty cheap. I don't pay a lot for stuff. Hardy's more expensive than CVS. You can save 15% with my offer code, but I didn't think that. I just don't spend money on a lot of stuff, and I do pay for Hardy because I feel like it works. I use the same offer code that I'm offering you. And I don't know. They have some really strong evidence on their website. If you don't want vitamins or they're not effective for you, even if the research says this thing works, if it doesn't work for you, it's your brain. I wouldn't start buying the biggest bottle. I would get a small one and see if you notice a difference. I did, and I hope it helps. Thanks.